Obstacles in the you wanna if everything is good every day, we know we could all come God.
Starting a whole conversation on brokenness may seem a bit paradoxical, a bit at odds, a little ironic. But today, that is how I want to open the conversation we will have on mental health and literature. I want to begin with sections of a poem by Kai Miller entitled The Broken, Part 6. Broken is the shape of everything, like yesterday, like memory. Now is so large. The present is everywhere. We break them into pieces, and they are all we have. They are all we carry into tomorrow. Broken bits. Broken is the shape and shade of everything, like our patched up dreams that once were whole. Now we hold on simply to its largest remnant. We squeeze so tight our hands bleed. The holding of every dream is a crucifixion. And broken is the final shape of everyone. It is the only way we could become who we are, by breaking out of, into. Consider now the evidence: scattered shells, halves of cocoons, doors torn from their hinges, windows flung and cracked against the stump of trees, walls like centuries discarded. Consider the dust that once was skin. Consider the cotton we outgrew. Consider shoes and their eventual mouths. But still we stand with splintered feet in this world of splinters, or skin scraped raw by our emerging. We have bruised ourselves into being. I want to welcome everyone to this moment on behalf of the Department of Literatures in English, and I want to invite you to participate in today's virtual conversation on mental health and literature, as we engage different panelists from a variety of contexts on ways in which stories, poems, and drawings have enabled us to access and understand what characterizes mental health and how we both manage and navigate mental health challenges through works of art. This conversation is really important in different ways and on several levels. As a society, we have tended to marginalize and limit the arts to spaces of entertainment, pleasure, something we turn to when life gets too heavy. Because of this kind of response to the arts, we have undervalued and minimally explored the role literature, language, and forms of art play in helping us to understand ourselves and those around us, and in therefore creating more opportunities for wholeness, for solutions, for impact, and for real and practical dimensions of change. So as we begin this conversation on mental health and literature today, let me introduce you to Dr. Jennifer Britton, one of our outstanding lecturers in the Department of Literatures in English, who will be leading us into dialogue with our second panelist, mental health professional and author, Marguerite Jennifer Joseph, who has recently published her first novel, a powerful text which takes us inside the experience of a mental illness which impacts a young woman and her entire community, Lady Under the Stairs. As a part of the discussion today, also, we have Vaughn Bailey, who's a current MPhil student in the Department of Literatures and English, interested in Caribbean cultural productions and theory, and whose research focuses on the intersections of Blackness and humanism in Jamaican diasporic films. Outside of academia, Vaughn's interests include convincing people of the value of watching poor quality media for their overall health and enjoyment. We also have Jared Hall, a finalizing college student at Rhode Island School of Design in the US. He has a keen interest in illustration, animation, and visual metaphors. He has recently created artwork which was influenced greatly by a friend who had been recently diagnosed with anxiety, and he's going to talk with us about a little of that today. From Kingston, Jamaica, we have Alistair Ellis, teacher of English literature, language, and communication studies at Bridgeport High School, graduate student in our MA program in Literatures in English, and poet. We also have Mrs. Khadijah Chin Bartley, teacher of English language and literature at Campion College, entrepreneur, real estate agent, founder and director of a wonderful company, Miss Education JA. We have as well Candice Thompson, an undergraduate student in the department, who is also a member of a creative writing club on campus and who has vested interest in the connection between mental health and literature. And I am Dr. Aisha Spencer, acting head of the Department of Literatures in English for this academic year. So now I'm going to turn you over to Dr. Jennifer Britton, who will now lead us into the very first part of this absolutely impactful conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Spencer, and hello and good afternoon to my fellow panelists. First, I want to say congratulations, Ms. Joseph, on the publication of The Lady Under the Stairs. I'm really glad for this chance to talk to you about your novel. I really enjoyed reading it. This novel has stakes. It doesn't shy away from difficult subjects. The title character, Lily, comes from a family that has worked for over 100 years on a plantation in St. Lucia, first as enslaved people, and then as paid farmhands and domestic workers. The novel connects one woman's mental illness to a long history of trauma on the island, while at the same time raising questions about the treatment of mental illness, past and present. I thought I would begin with the figure of the mad woman, a figure that's long been important in Caribbean and feminist literature. Writers have found in the so-called mad woman in the attic an archive of history lost, suppressed, or dismissed. The mad woman has become a repository of anger, power, and a defiant opacity, whether in Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, the poem The Mad Woman of Papine by Jamaican poet Slade Hopkinson, Haitian-American writer Edwidge Dantecont's Crick Crack, or Jamaican-American poet Shara McCallum's 2017 collection, Mad Woman. The mad woman at the center of The Lady Under the Stairs is mixed race, a product of the plantation. It occurred to me reading your novel that the plantation and the mental asylum have some uncanny similarities. Both are sites of displacement, family separation, and unpaid labor. We read of the asylum in your novel. It was well known that the patients did all the back-breaking chores, unquote. Again, like the plantation, the asylum is a site of sexual assault with babies born unrecognized by fathers, which leads me finally to my first question. I'm wondering if you have found the figure of the mad woman useful for establishing connections between mental illness and the particular challenges and injustices that women have faced or still face.
Anytime we attach an adjective to anybody, whether it's mad, whether it's crazy, it automatically puts them in a class, or it automatically puts them in a space where people believe that they are a certain thing and needs to be treated in a particular way. So the concept of mad, the word itself has two kinds of definitions. It has mad in a sense of anger, and mad in a sense of mental illness. So yes, having a mental illness does pose people at very high risk, many risks that society is not even aware of, but they do exist.
I think about, the woman at the center of your novel, a mixed race woman, and the way that her light skin confers privilege while also being a marker of trauma, right? A kind of trauma that hides in plain sight. Now for a related question. This novel focuses on one woman in particular, but actually multiple women who experience mental illness. I'm wondering if it's harder to talk about mental illness among men. Is there still too great a stigma?
There is a great stigma, but I think women themselves are more willing to speak about their own problems. So you would find women who may have an issue, they may talk about it, they may see, even in the mental health setting, we would find that more women may present with mental illnesses, but at that time we had more men in the mental asylum. So women speak more about their feelings, about their emotions. It's natural for women to cry more, and it's also, it's a way of actually expressing some of the things that are deep inside.
And I think about the way that psychological instability has been and perhaps still is associated with women, right?
Yeah.
Viewed as an inherently female trait or predilection. Do you think that's still the case?
I think it's still the case that we are seen as unstable, unpredictable. Even in the job space, you may say, okay, you would prefer to have a man as a head because they seem to be more level-headed, and women seem to make decisions based on emotions, etc. So women are still kind of stigmatized because of, we quote unquote, the softer side of women, the more emotional side of women.
Okay. My next question has to do with the setting of the novel. We know that the story is set in St. Lucia and it opens on the Mackenzie cocoa plantation. But the novel keeps you guessing about the time period. Our first clue comes just a few pages in. We read, quote, "Though many things had changed since emancipation, running water and flush toilets remained the domain of the plantation owners," unquote. So we presume we're in the colonial period, but there are no dates to anchor us in time until quite close to the end of the novel. This is when one character, Maisie, returns from England to a now independent St. Lucia. So you now know it's post-1979. And I think of this temporal ambiguity as both smart and significant. I wonder if you view the Mackenzie plantation as stuck in time or stuck in a loop.
It's in a certain sense, yes, it was stuck in time because the whole scenery, the whole the boss, the white privilege versus the up and coming laborers. People still tended to be laborers, those who actually remained on the plantation, and they were still subservient. They still treated well, not technically masters, but the bosses. They relied on them for virtually almost everything that they needed to survive.
I like that technique that you used. I mean, because I'm a historian, I kept wanting to pin it down. And then after a while, I thought, oh, maybe this is actually creating more meaning than giving me a more precise time marker. So many events on the plantation seem like echoes of the past, creating a kind of hall of mirrors effect. Just to give one example, Maisie becomes a housemaid in the great house on the plantation, at which point her story essentially bends backward to become her grandmother's. So I guess part of overcoming historical trauma is the feeling like you're actually moving ahead in time, and being stuck in a loop or actually time bending backwards could really work against that. Lily might have escaped the fate of previous women in her family. She was raised in the city rather than on the plantation. But her desire to know her mother brings her back, and then it would seem her fate is sealed.
Yeah.
She was 16 when she comes to the plantation. Her mother was 16 when she came to the plantation. So I like these echoes. I think they're really effective. And as you were just mentioning, it connects up to the persistence of white entitlement on the plantation and in the culture at large, right? So you get white plantation owners or managers claiming the right to local teenage girls, or a white plantation owner's wife feeling that she can take a Black woman's child as her property. So certainly strong echoes of the past there. I liked the evidence of some research in the novel, which I wanted to ask you about next. There's a reference to the Mental Treatment Act of 1957, and you identify words applied to the mentally ill, including deranged, imbecile, idiot, feeble-minded, and morally defective. So I wonder if you might tell us about any research that you did or how you drew on your own experience as a healthcare professional.
I think most of the mental health aspects I drew from my own experience. I have read quite a bit of the mental health legislation, which technically is what exists today. They have not changed. They keep, handing down and say it's 1956, but the exact same wording exists even as we speak. So in some of the islands in the Caribbean, the mental health legislation has not changed from probably over 100 years. So people, it is still, we don't use those terms anymore, but it is written in the legislation. They're referred to as idiots, imbeciles. It is actually written and it's there for everyone to see. So most of these things I've visited most of the islands in the OECS, Antigua, Antigua, St. Kitts, St. Vincent. Most of them still use they call it the Mental Treatment Act. It used to be called the Lunatic Ordinance, but then the name changed to the Mental Treatment Act.
Wow, what would it take to change that language, do you think?
Well, I know in our case in St. Lucia, we have drafted new legislation, and I am sure it is sitting somewhere for over 10 years. So it would take, I've worked in mental health, I've done advocacy, and that is why I shifted into writing, because it is another avenue to bring the message across. We march, we make presentations, we do all sorts of things, have public talks, presentations to cabinet of ministers, and yet still, in some instances, mental health has moved forward, but in some instances, it has remained exactly the same.
I can see the importance of publishing a novel of this kind then for the conversations that it allows to happen. Yeah. One of the last things I thought I would talk to you about concerns the representation of trauma and the novel's ending, without giving anything away, I promise. So trauma has an uneasy relationship with narrative. Trauma can't be fully incorporated into an individual's personal history, their story of themselves, because traumatic experience is relived rather than remembered. Some argue that as unmetabolized history, trauma exists outside time. And I found myself haunted by the quiet traumas of the novel. There's the central trauma that attracts a lot of your attention, but there are quiet traumas that go undiscussed or maybe even unrecognized. For example, to go back to a character who I've talked about a little bit, Maisie, at 16, she doesn't want to take her grandmother's place on the plantation. She has other career plans, but her attempts to escape this life fail. We read, quote, Maisie even tried to run away, but she had no one and nowhere to run to. Her extended family thought that Granny had her best interest at heart and fully supported the old matriarch's decision. I'm not so sure that this is all that different from the family leaving Lily in the asylum. I'm interested in those sorts of connections. So I'm wondering how you thought through the challenges of representing trauma. And a related question, I wondered if you found it challenging to come up with an ending for the story, especially a story that deals with so much intergenerational trauma, and if you considered different endings.
Yes, I did consider a totally different ending. The book that started off is not what the end product was. Writing this book in itself is traumatic. Just some of the scenes, as you know, they are, even for the writer, it's very emotional writing certain things. So yeah, people did say to me there were areas I could have developed more, and I agree, but I wanted to get over it, get it done, because it was kind of a really struggle to deal with even some of those things. And these are issues that I have witnessed, that I've known. I've worked in mental health for over 30 years. When I first joined the mental health service, it was a very traumatic experience for me, because at my early 20s, I never knew such conditions actually existed. You know, we know there is a mental hospital, but to actually go behind the walls and see what was happening, that was probably in the mid 80s, and I was shocked. I did not believe that people, human beings who were being treated in a healthcare facilities were being treated in that way. So even writing the story, it was a bit traumatic, but it was also a bit cleansing, because these are things that as a mental health worker, sometimes you take on some of the trauma of some of the people around you. So you need, it also was a way of it's still a way of cleansing, of saying, okay, that's it. I'm coming towards the end of my career. And this is my quote unquote, to culminate, you know, what I have done in mental health over the last 30 years.
Oh, that's really interesting. As though, you know, in writing the novel, you then say to your public, this is a collective burden. Some of the burden that you've carried as a mental health professional, you then say this is really a collective burden and a conversation that needs to happen. I know we need to draw to a close soon. The narrator tells us of Maisie, quote, her philosophy was that pain, once inflicted, can never be healed, unquote. It's possible that Maisie changes her mind about this. I'm not sure. But the novel does have some crucial loose ends. And I say crucial because I think they're actually really important to the novel. We're left wondering, what happened to Maisie's mother? Who was she? We don't know anything about her. It's not so surprising given the context that we don't know much about her father, but her mother, right? And then there's a question that Becky leaves hanging. What would life have been if she were raised Black instead of white? What a question to pose, right? And then there are the nameless women in the novel. And this lost history opens a kind of rift in the story, which I certainly don't mean as a criticism. I think with these loose ends, the novel meets the challenge of how to tell a story that must also remain untellable. And so I thought that was a real strength.
I would say I wrote the book, but I do not consider myself a technically correct writer or an author. You know, because in discussing certain aspects of writing, so now I'm kind of formalizing, reading more about crafting books and et cetera, et cetera. So it was kind of raw, let's say almost raw writing based on experience.
I think it's a brave thing to do, to write. And there have been plenty of examples of authors that are also heads of insurance companies and doctors and, you know, any number of professions. And I could feel the labor that went into this story. And because it has real stakes, it must have been also difficult to write. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so are you going to read a few bits and pieces for us from the text? Yes?
Yes, I selected two very short readings, just to give you an idea of some of what has happened. First one, it's after regaining consciousness, Lily remained in hospital for another 2 weeks. This extended stay was as a result of her refusal to eat, her refusal to speak, and constant crying, which was sometimes accompanied by aggressive behavior towards Patsy and the staff of the hospital. At times, she lay on the bed and just stared at the ceiling and mumbled to herself. One morning, the nurses entered the room to find her gone. A search was initiated and Lily was found walking along the road, which she believed would eventually lead to her baby. She was barefooted and drenched by the early morning rain and still in her night clothes. The family was at a loss for what could be done to save Lily, for she was proving to be a challenge for the staff at the hospital. When she was eventually discharged, the family was given instructions to have her admitted to the asylum if her condition did not improve. Over my dead body, Patsy thought, remembering some of the horror stories she had heard about that place and what she had seen when she visited with her prayer group. The inmates were always unkempt and this place reeked of urine and feces. This option would definitely be one of last resort. Oh my God, what a situation. What have I done? At home, Lily's moods remained unchanged. Bath time was a challenge, and her meals became mainly porridge and soup, which was spoon-fed mainly by her dad, Bertie. Come, Lil, come eat a little something for Dada, he would say. And she would cooperate with him, consuming a few spoonfuls of whatever was offered. This happened twice a day, in the morning before he left for work, and on evenings upon his return. It was obvious that the situation had broken his heart, and the situation caused him to become resentful once again towards his wife. So this is just to give you a description of some of the symptoms that Lily was going through.
Right.
And coincidentally, you talked about the legislation, and this is one of the sections I actually chose to read. The option of having Lily admitted to the asylum was at the bottom of Patsy's list, but nevertheless, it was an option. She had visited the gray and white building complex surrounded by tall barbed wire fences located about 10 miles from the city. Although she was not an Adventist, Patsy had accompanied the women's charity group of the Seventh-day Adventist Church to donate food, clothing, and many of the goodies available to the community at large, but not to those committed. She discovered that many of the asylum residents loved dry coconuts, which led Patsy and her team to spending the Saturday afternoon prior to their visit, gathering and chopping coconuts. Patsy was always disturbed by what she saw when she visited. Most of the people were disheveled and without shoes. Out of habit or out of need, they were always begging for food, for cigarettes, and for the gifts which were willingly brought to them. Was that the life which lay ahead for her, Lily? Hope not. And I would just skip this paragraph, and she went to visit her lawyer to explain. Morning, Mr. Thomas. Patsy was anxious to get down to business. The lawyer confirmed that the document from the doctor was a medical certificate indicating that if someone were ever taken to the asylum, they would be considered a person of unsound mind and a proper subject of confinement. Is it a legal document then? Yes, it comes from the Mental Treatment Act. This law is mainly used to get people into and out of the asylum because it was thought that people of unsound mind who require treatment do not have the ability to make decisions for themselves and need someone else, most often a family member, to act on their behalf. To Patsy, the term confinement sounded like prison, and she expresses to the lawyer, well, in a way it is. People are placed in the asylum most times against their will to protect them from hurting themselves or hurting other people. I'm going to skip most of this, and to the end, she said, okay, that is enough. After the lawyer explained everything, and she said, is this how the law defines sick people? Incredible. She was visibly shaken by what she was hearing. She saw her daughter's state of mind as a product of her circumstances. She was lost for words, and all the pent-up emotions she had been holding for the last 10 months came to the fore. She began breathing heavily, then shaking, then sobbing quietly. The lawyer was taken aback by Patsy's display of emotion. This was a first for him. It was usually the soon-to-be divorced woman crying about her husband's infidelity and the inadequacy of the settlement, or a parent trying to get their child out of a difficult legal situation, or some other aggrieved person who had their land stolen from them. But the sight of a broken mother weeping about the fate of a sick daughter was heart-wrenching even for him. He reached out and patted her on the shoulder, made an offer of tissue and a glass of water.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Britton, as well, for leading in that interview. What an intriguing interview with Jennifer Joseph. We recognize that getting inside the story is one of the most powerful experiences the reader or audience will have. It is what pulls them in. It's what brings them closer to the representation of the reality of the mental health challenge. And that's what makes it so powerful. Thank you for sharing those readings with us. I'm going to move into just following that line of discussion. I want to really get into looking at the artistic process. The crafting, it's something that was mentioned. And I want to start off by asking Jared, just I asked Jared to be a part of this conversation because when we are in literature classes, there's some of us who use artistic images to guide our students through the processes of interpreting and responding to literary works of art. And Jared, your artwork on Instagram immediately got my attention. It got my attention because there is a deep connection between reading a literary piece and reading a work of art. So as we talk about mental health and coming into this concept of the artistic process, the crafting of the work, and how works of art enable us to engage with this topic, I would love you to guide us through the process of creating that you went through. What inspired you to create this particular piece on mental health? And I think we'll show the image shortly of what you created, Jared. But what inspired you to create this particular piece on mental health, and take us through how you moved from the point of an idea to the representation of that idea?
Well, this all becomes a lot easier to explain once you see the piece. But I read somewhere that the mind is like a garden. And I really like that metaphor because I think of mental illness as something like a weed. It's natural, but hard to maintain or control. Not really something you'd really want to have around, but you just have to deal with it. And I think self-care itself is so much like taking care of a garden. It's not glamorous or exciting, it's just maintenance. And both plants and people need water and sunshine. So my intention with this piece was to depict someone overwhelmed by their anxieties. The pot represents the self and the weeds are out of control. And I spoke to a friend of mine who was diagnosed with anxiety. And that became really crucial because initially I had two ideas for how I wanted to depict this. I initially just wanted to have that face-shaped pot with the weeds coming out. And, the weeds representing the mental illness, the pots representing the self, you get it. Or the other idea was to have no pot and just have the brain overrun by weeds. And my friend said something that really stuck with me. He said, having anxiety or any other mental illness, it's like your biology is working against you. For people in that situation, sometimes your depression or your anxiety feels like all you are. It can feel like it's taken over your life, like you're broken. So I realized that I needed both, the biological cause, the brain, as well as the consequences that has on identity, the broken pot. And that was my intention. But what's really interesting is I've shown this piece to a lot of people by now, and they actually get a more hopeful read on it than I initially intended. To them, it represents how even during difficult times when your brain feels like it's overloaded, you can still make something beautiful. When your brain, when perhaps all art is inspired by trauma, by feeling broken or feeling some imbalance and wanting to correct that. And I think both interpretations are totally valid, but that's what, all those things together are what inspired me to make this work.
Awesome. And that connects with the poem that was read before, maybe as broken as how we start. All right. Just one more question for you, Jared. As you thought of representing, how did you manage that process of images and symbols? You coming from the conversation with your friend, what led you to determining that you're going to use a broken pot, that you're going to utilize weeds? Because I think that's something that's so important in the process of interpretation and how we read works of art, just the connection, the associations with the images and how they're being used to represent the reality. What led you to choosing these specific images and symbols?
Well, as I said, it all really comes back to that metaphor of the mind as a garden. And the mind being something natural but biological, and how that can be turned against you. Weeds are something that everyone who has a garden has to deal with. everyone with mental illness has to go with this thing that they don't really want, but it's just a part of them, and they got to take them out every day, take them out. Like self-care, like taking care of yourself, like going to therapy. It's not pretty, it's not glamorous, but you have to do it to take care of yourself. And the symbols just came so naturally from that. The weeds, the brain, the pot. It was almost like they really built on each other in a natural way that just made it really easy for me to make the piece.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So I want to just look at how literature really helps us to imagine and understand mental health coming out of these conversations so far. And I want to turn to Vaughn. And Vaughn, based on your own engagement with various genres of literature and your knowledge of our Jamaican society and our Jamaican culture, could you share with us on the ways in which literature which focuses on mental health experiences or realities actually allows us to imagine, to connect with, to understand ourselves as individuals and then as a community of people? Can you speak to that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So I don't want to go through this by reading a section from this book that came out in 2018.
Sure.
It's titled Madness in Anglophone Caribbean Literature and it's a collection of essays on the category of madness in the Caribbean. And it's also the first one of its kind and the first book on madness. The first extended study of madness was done in 2013 by Kelly Baker Joseph. And that was the first time people started to take madness or just mental health in that vein as something very serious to think about. And so within this text, they give this quote, right, where they opened up an introduction, where they called for to view the Caribbean through a lens of more nuanced terminology. And in doing so, they claim to, and quoting, push beyond seeing the Caribbean as a deranged space to regard it as one that accommodates altered states of consciousness. So we understand the Caribbean as a space that's been ravaged by colonialism and anti-Blackness. And because of this, we are kind of not necessarily to be pathologized as, mentally unstable or ill, but there are real issues that we have to face and constantly combat. And so while reading this text, my mind, it kind of hyper-focused on the word of accommodation and like how do we as a society accommodate those who struggle with mental illness or those who are affected by mental health issues. And oftentimes it's not very well, but the thing that really stands out to me is that we need to think of the terms of accommodation. Like how do we as a culture, make space for those who are mentally, how do we as a culture make space for those who aren't as well? Because the real question for me is like, we should focus on those who are on the edge of society, marginalized, and those who suffer the most at the issues of mental illness, and then take what we gain from them or the solutions that would help them, apply those to society at large, And this way we can think of, how to move towards a more ethical society, a more healthy society, one that enables all involved to function at their best. Because it's not just the mentally ill are outliers, but there is a system. There are forces within the world, colonialism and advances as examples, that do kind of critically and terminally affect us, that make us behave in ways that we wouldn't want to or limit our capacities to be in the world. And so a focus for me on how literature allows us to think about this is when it privileges the narratives of the most marginalized. So a lot of Caribbean literature is focused on the mad woman, as Dr. Britton has focused, as I'd mentioned earlier, the poor, the ratchet, and how we can think about these characters as people and how we can learn from them to think about our society and how we can change it for the better.
Absolutely. That's great. And that's such an in-depth comment as well on the transformative power of the literature to get us to rethink, to reconceptualize, to reshape, and then to act on that. Because the more we do that, it conceptually, as the more it begins to flesh out in behavior. So that's really powerful. As someone, you're constantly engaging with literary text, and I've been able to sit in and listen to you speak on some of your just your responses to these texts and through film as well. Even if these texts are not always focused on the experience of mental health illnesses or mental health challenges, tell me, what do you think it will enable for you as you engage? And I want to think specifically of the process of reading, interpreting, and responding, Vaughn. So people tend to think of reading in a very passive way. You just take up the book but there are processes that encourage skills and skill sets. And so as you engage and interact with characters, something is happening in the processes of reading, interpreting, and responding that's creating a shift, that's enabling some kind of engagement. Can you speak to what it enables for you as a reader and one who engages in that way? And by extension, what it may enable for somebody else going through those processes?
Oh, definitely. So I guess a good way to start this would be to think of a book I think that has affected me in like radical ways. That's Shawnee Mutu's Serious Blooms at Night. And in reading this book, she speaks a lot about queer kinship and queer communities that are formed of people who are not necessarily, queer in like a sexuality way, but queer in a marginalized way, which I have issues with as a term, but it's the like gesture. So it's to think of how we can, form communities alongside the lines of marginalization. And I think that reading this text forces you to reevaluate how we exist as a society and what are the acts and practices that we do that kind of diminish or harm community, and how, we as people, as active characters in our own lives, need to sit down and think of ways to better serve ourselves and our communities. And, this is obviously done through her use of metaphors, her use of she weaves this great narrative of interspecies kinship, where we can understand nature and human as one, and that we need to come together as a species, as different species, to bring forth new ways of being in the world, new ideas to talk about the world. And I think that this is something for me, I could come to it on my own and somehow, I would hope, but reading her text and like thinking of how I would read this, because at first I was reading it and I was like, okay, I'm kind of apprehensive because of how it deals with trauma. It just puts it in your face and everything. And it's like, there's a way in which the text allows you to read trauma much more, it takes the edge off it as opposed to dealing it within the world. And like, it made me stop and think about, wait, why am I trying to run from the trauma in the text? And what is this symptomatic of? And how, as a society, oftentimes we run from the trauma. We run from people with severe mental illness. We run from people who are, have difficult stories, are difficult to deal with, in quotation marks. Right. Literature allows us to stop and evaluate ourselves, and then to evaluate community and how we can move forward as a better, I guess, community. So to speak.
Community.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vaughn, for sharing that. I'm going to move to Candice for a while. Just coming out of that and also thinking of what Jennifer Joseph said in terms of how difficult it was to create this text. And I found, even reading it, that there were points where, I had to hold my breath. And actually, I was glad that some points didn't continue in a particular way, just because it allowed me to experience for that moment and then kind of move forward still without needing to get into the full extent of that trauma, that traumatic experience. So Candice, you've heard today with our focus on Lady Under the Stairs, you've heard Jared, you've heard Vaughn, and we've experienced through the work of Caribbean writers like Jean Richard, McCollum, Barry Gilroy, Jean Benta Breeze. We also have artistically Edna Manley in her efforts to capture the suffering of Black Jamaicans and yet convey the spirit of hope and endurance in the face of struggle. So the literary text and visual forms of art can also function as forms of activism. And if I'm listening to Vaughn, that's where it would lead. That representation becomes a form of activism in itself, calling on us as a society to be more aware, to be more accepting, to be more understanding of the various mental health challenges individuals face. So Candice, I want to ask you, based on the role you play as an undergrad student in the DLIE, and you're also involved in the process of creative writing, which is something that's very important to you. In what ways do you think literary texts actually function or can function as literary artifacts in this space of activism?
Hi, well, I think we can all agree that the global crises that we've collectively been affected by have shifted attitudes towards mental illness. And with quarantine and the threat of deadly illness, it has caused us to experience a shared trauma. And that's a reality that's not new to many of us. Mental health and well-being has been taboo in our culture for so long, with only a few tentative strides in recent history to reform public perception and response. So I kind of think of like the saying, "He who feels it knows it." It rings true now that self-isolation and lockdowns have revealed a host of mental illnesses and things that have gone unaddressed and undiagnosed. So in and outside of this academic space, as students and faculty, we're now critically examining certain prejudices and ramifications of poor mental health, now that the effects are undeniable and widespread. So in the literary and artistic arena, you know, we've long explored these topics, as we've seen with Miss Johnson, but I feel like in the mainstream, it has only been like touched on a surface level. But now there is an emergence of novels and films and songs that boldly tackle mental health and well-being in nuanced ways. And I think it allows for those of us that have been suffering in silence to kind of feel validated and acknowledged, and in less fear of these negative labels from like people who used to scoff at invisible illnesses. Now they have a somewhat realistic frame of reference to relate to and identify with, and they can acknowledge that these aren't issues that only affect a small subset of the population, and it's not something that's far removed from any individual, because now you have, like, you can point to a cousin or a friend or a teacher or a colleague that is affected. So it forces us to take responsibility for gaps in our knowledge and unlearn old sentiments and behaviors, and recognize that those affected shouldn't be ostracized or considered social pariah as if it's something contagious.
Right. And so what I'm hearing from that also is art enabling access, allowing us to manage our realities, you know, in a very powerful way, which we may not necessarily be able to do outside of in that way, as Vaughn was saying, because it gives us this compact version in a way that we can handle it. That's interesting. What do you think? I want to look at the creative writing process, just because people tend to think the creative writing process only belongs to somebody who's going to become an author. And you heard Jennifer Joseph earlier. It's her first novel. She's coming out of the mental health profession. And this is almost like her legacy, you know, wrapped up, all these stories that she has carried with her. I think when I heard her story, I was thinking of Erna Broadbaugh as well, and the way in which Stories of Jamaican Women, she wrote that collection of short stories, pulling together all these stories of different Jamaican women based on her role as a sociologist. In terms of the creative writing process, and I want to think specifically of your role in the Creative Writing Club in the DLIE, what do you think the process of creative writing can enable for students, and not just students really, for anyone? What do you think that creative writing process can enable as people attempt to manage their mental health in the midst of all the crises that they're possibly facing in our society right now?
Well, to begin, like, I feel like the change for me, it brought to mind the modernist period after World War I, where we saw creatives moving away from traditional practices, and they had begun to experiment with new forms and techniques to reflect the upheaval of their life and their new reality through literature and art. And I now see that I see similar motivations cropping up in young creatives on social media and my peers within the UM Writer Circle and other humanities majors. I've seen students who are artistically inclined or not turn to literature and writing to relieve angst, stress, and bottled emotions for a bit of escapism, whether as spectators or participating directly in the creative process. And I'm fortunate enough to be a part of a community like the Writers Circle, where we can freely discuss and engage with certain topics and make art together. We can comment on each other's art. People get even personal. It's not just a thing where, all right, we're working on a poem for a class. Like, we can pause, we have moments, we have meetings where we're just like vibing with each other, we're taking a break. I remember last year, around this time, used to meet like once a week outside of like club times just to hang out, and then it became like a staple where every other day, because it was like a place where we found solace with each other. Like, as busy as we were, we kept taking that time out to come together, because it was a space where we within ourselves could acknowledge like mental illness. It wasn't a thing, it wasn't a taboo topic. Like, there are people who are afflicted and it wasn't a place where you felt scorned, like you could freely talk about how it was affecting your life.
Right. So it's a freeing of self. A freeing of self was occurring within that artistic space.
Yeah, and I feel like even now with the media, I've heard peers who couldn't conceive of the realities of students suffering with depression or crippling anxiety point to book and TV characters, and they can now identify signs and symptoms of both, and they're now able to empathize and sympathize more deeply. And I've seen older generations, a lot of our parents and teachers confront certain prejudices, and instead of maintaining a state of willful ignorance, people are more willing to learn. And now we have a lot of websites and social media platforms dedicated specifically to relaying information about mental health in digestible formats, which kind of like pick at your brain to like delve further and explore for yourself. So I can say from my personal experience as a student who suffers from an anxiety disorder, and it's been a long time. So I've seen the change and the progression in society, where before people couldn't understand and they would say things like, oh, that's like an old people thing, like, you know, because they couldn't see it, and they couldn't see when I was going through like a specific moment of panic. Nobody could really understand. A lot of teachers couldn't, my family couldn't. And now, because of media, a lot of people can jump up and say, you know, oh, you're like that girl in that show. And it's been trippy, but it's been rewarding to see how we've progressed and how more empathetic people have been. And it kind of makes, I think for me and other people who are afflicted, like the future doesn't seem so dreadful anymore, because we're seeing a lot of more accommodation and a lot more activism for people like us. And a lot of my peers do that too through their art. So yeah, it's been great to see.
Yes, and thank you for that, because that's so powerful, and allowing us to see how it works practically. That it is a process, but it's a process that works eventually in the changing and shifting of mindsets. I want to turn just based on that, because pedagogy becomes important there, and literary pedagogy becomes important, because it's not just the reading of the text, but how we provide that access to students, how we allow students to get into that text, and how we manage the processes of reading, interpretation, and response. So Mrs. Khadija Tim Bartley, right? One of my past students, teacher of English at Cavion College, and so many other things, fitting into so many other roles and shoes. I've read a number of your posts on Instagram through your Miss Education Jamaica, Miss Education JA. You can check her out on Instagram. Quite, usually sometimes controversial, sometimes pushing that question, asking us to consider our roles as teachers of English, and also to consider the way in which, the things in which we value, and the way in which we place value in the experience of the classroom. An entrepreneur, a real estate agent as well. And I noticed you apply your creative writing and language skills there to the construction of these narratives, and you're also helping people. And that stood out for me, that you've brought it home in all your roles. Talk to me a little about how insistence on traditional approaches to teaching or seeing literature end up limiting and confining students, and actually creating some of the mental health challenges that we would rather not see.
Well, I think we'd have to kind of touch on what these traditional approaches are. I think first of all, it starts systemically from the choosing of the texts, the poems that we do, and there seems to be so little thought or input given to the students and the actual issues that they face. That's one of the deepest issues. Then when the issues are presented, we tend to sidestep them, the things that naturally emerge from the text. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to give the children free rein to talk about it. We don't know where this is going. We're going to just keep them down, And then, to borrow from you as my past teacher, we analyze the books to death. We hack them apart for themes and devices and character traits, and don't take time to really settle into the text and allow it to be a space where we can really enter into it and enter into ourselves through it. I think what this does is that it deters students from loving reading. And people always say students don't love reading. I don't think that's true. I think they can. But I think we have made it a space that doesn't welcome them. It's a space that they don't fit into. It's like a noose or a corset, something that we wrap around them. It's not a space that they organically fit into. We limit the transformative power of literature, and we dismiss their issues, which creates a greater divide between them and us, the people who could most be able to help them. And then we cuss and we say, boy, you know, these children live in their own world and this generation is slipping away from us and they don't want to engage with us as adults. I think I can fix that. And I see that every day in my classroom. Something that students share with me based on the discussions that we have from the text, they shock themselves by what they are willing to say out loud. And that's because of using literature as a space to enter into those kinds of discussions.
Great. All right. I mean, okay, so you've answered the second question I was going to ask. So I'm going to jump to the third question, really. I wanted to look at your own engagement, right? So having seen you as my student and having watched you develop and grow and move into different careers, one of the things that remains constant about you is the way that you engage people in a type of critical, analytical way, and causing them to think about their lives. So even when I'm reading your real estate, I'm feeling like there's something I need to be thinking about how I'm making a choice or how I'm thinking about, you know, and it pulls me back into the literary at all times. How do you think your own engagement with literature has provided a distinct kind of skill set, which allows you to have the kind of perspective or outlook on life you have, which eventually actually ends up supporting and promoting mental health?
I think definitely we engage with literature in different ways at different points in our life. Clearly, when you were sitting down and listening to Cinderella being read by your parents, it's not the same kind of engagement that you have now. And I think my latest form of engagement with literature started at CAPE. CXC gets lots of backlash, mostly from me, but I think CAPE is, it was a place where I really got to sit with the texts and tear them apart in a way that was also tearing myself apart. And I saw, in a good way, and I saw the power of stories and the way that we can process trauma and heal through stories. I also think it started at about 15, 16 with like the marathons of Grey's Anatomy that used to come on in the summer. And I remember one episode where the main character's best friend, Christina, her best friend main character is Meredith, her best friend is Christina, and she goes to Meredith's therapist and Christina says she's an 8. And she says her average pain on any given day is an 8. And I was like, oh my God, I'm an 8. And I just bawled. From that, I was able to see that, wow, you know, seeing yourself in a certain character can be healing, and it can give you words that you didn't have for things that you were feeling all this time and things that other people were experiencing. And I wanted to bring that to other people. And so I from that point on, I decided I would never teach or dictate or do anything without a story, because stories are powerful. Stories are the most powerful form of communication that we have. And so I think I just carry that everywhere with me. And when you piece it apart, that's all it is. It's telling stories.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you so much. I want to move from that, coming out of that teaching experience and out of the diverse ways in which the narrative becomes important, to moving to Alistair. And it was brought up earlier by Dr. Britton in the conversation about males and the responses to mental health. And you know I have to now go there with you. Thank you for being with us. As a male teacher of literature, a poet, you're an MA graduate student in the DLIE. I would love you to talk with us a bit on the dynamics involved in teaching literature, particularly to male students, how you manage and navigate the stigmas and stereotypes that surround this process. Talk to us about that. You need to click off your mute. You're right, there you go.
When you sent those to me, I immediately said, you know what? I have a lot to share on this.
Wow.
Before we even get into the classroom, there's profound stigma surrounding female teachers of literature. I remember once my older brother was introducing me to a political candidate in our area. He was trying to, rally support from younger members of the community. And I remember what he chose as an icebreaker, just because he knew that I was studying literature at Michael at the time, was, I kid you not, he said, people normally say male literature teachers are effeminate. And I was like, what? This is really the first comment that he has to make about me. That he thought it was clever and it was an icebreaker. But for me, it was insulting, because he thought he needed to say that and he needed to make a point out of that. And there's a stigma right away about males who study literature. And then that filters down all the way to the students. And especially when you don't operate in a school, at a school where literature is compulsory, I think it discourages a lot of male students from choosing literature, because it is seen as, to be quite frank, a girl subject, which it isn't, because reading is such a useful activity. It's so critical, it's so important that it can't just be for girls, because then what are you saying about men? But I'm really grateful about the experiences that I've had so far, though. I can remember good experiences teaching texts like Things Fall Apart. I've had good experiences with male students with one of my personal favorite dramas from Shakespeare, Othello, because I think the characters of Okonkwo and Othello provide us with meaningful opportunities to engage in discussions about mental health. Because a lot of times we focus on when we think about mental health, we think about mental illness. When I think about Okonkwo, when I think about Othello, I think about these powerful male figures with compromised mentalities. Because if we even look at Othello was a man, he was very important. He was of high status, but he just could not escape. From a personal level, he could not escape that stigma that was attached to the Moors, the stereotypes attached to the Moors. And even with this beautiful wife, Desdemona, if we think of Desdemona as symbolic of certain opportunities that might present ourselves, that's one of the discussions I always try to engage my students in, especially our male students, that mental health is so important, because if we don't learn to get over these stigmas and stereotypes that they're always going to be operating in our space, if we don't learn to cope with them, they can compromise us to such a great degree that even when we have these great opportunities around us, we think we are so unfitting of them that we basically just forfeit them.
I'm going to jump in for Dr. Spencer, who's having trouble hearing. Totally fascinating. Do you feel like when you are in the classroom, you're able to engage the boys in the room so that you can start to have conversations about mental health?
Definitely. And a lot of pieces, sometimes you don't go into them, sometimes on the surface, seeing opportunities to discuss mental health, but certainly as you go through them. I can remember one of the years when I taught Things Fall Apart, and we got to the end, and I think I had like 4 or 5 boys in that group, and they were affected by the decision that Okonkwo made to take his own life at the end of the text. They were like, sir, why did he do that? Why did he see the need to do that? I'm not satisfied with this ending. And then we retraced our steps. We went all the way back to the beginning and I said, all right, let's retrace everything that happened. Why do you think he felt the need to do that? And as we started to unpack, and I saw some of them were like, sir, just feel like he need to have to act like a man. I said, all right, I like that phrase that you use, act like a man. I said, do you think you have to act like a man? Of course, they're going to say, no, sir, we're real, we don't have to act. And I'm like, no, stop that. Everyone puts on a facade at some point in time, right? Everyone puts on a facade. Why do you feel a need to put on a facade? If you're already a man, what's forcing you to then act like a man? Why act? and you're already that. And then as we engage in further discussion, that's when they start to realize that society is always there. And so when I thought about this presentation, the metaphor or symbol that came to mind for me was colonization. If you think of your mind like the Americas in 1492, and you think about stigmas and stereotypes like as Columbus and the conquistadors coming into the New World, you need to rebuff those stigmas and stereotypes, because they're always going to be there. And we are caught in this cycle, this mental cycle of, let's say, colonization, and trying to find ways to decolonize our minds, because our minds really are sites of contestation.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that you have those conversations in the classroom. I know that at UE, students can really get excited about deconstructing gender. I think it can be very liberating to have those kinds of conversations. And you're reminding me of something that came up just a little earlier about avoiding an overly programmatic pedagogical style, right? When you look at a work of literature, if you're just dissecting it for tropes or literary devices, or if you're just teaching for a test, because I think critical thinking requires engagement with oneself, right? How can you become a strong critical thinker if you're not willing to look at yourself? And sometimes that requires even a kind of confrontation with yourself. What you've been brought up to believe is true, what you've been brought up to believe is natural. And those conversations also need to happen in the classroom. And they can certainly be the most, you can get the fiercest debates. Things can start to spiral in directions you didn't anticipate. But I think that's when a discussion around literature can really feel relevant, as opposed to identify a moment of irony. At the end of the day, is that really so important? Or why would we prioritize that over the kind of conversation that could actually really be helpful and build critical thinking?
Yeah, and I always try to balance that. So yes, we have to look at the formal features, we have to look at the thematic elements, but we have to engage in conversations about the text, because honestly, those are some of the most interesting aspects of teaching literature, when you get your students to engage in conversation, because you can learn so much about them and about society in general, because we really have to move away from, I would still say move away from, because I think some persons are still of the mindset that these students aren't affected by things in their world. And this virtual space that they have to navigate can be very vicious. And it at times forces them to give in to certain stigmas and stereotypes, especially the stereotypes of trying to fit into a particular image. And that's something I didn't have to navigate that much when I was that young. And if we don't use these cultural artifacts, we don't use literature to help them to engage in conversation and really realize just how much society pushes back at them, just how invasive society is. Because imagine trying to fit into a stereotype in the confines of your home with nobody around. It shows just how invasive society is. It shows just how invasive stigmas and stereotypes are. And if we don't get them to engage in conversation, if we don't get them to realize that, look, you can't just live your life as this walking mass of stigmas and stereotypes, then we're going to lose them, to be honest.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Wow, this has been a seriously enlightening conversation. Thank you, Dr. Britton, for taking over at that point. Thank you to everybody who's been a part of this discussion today. I think you recognize the depth and breadth of this kind of discussion, and the fact that we need to have these discussions more of these discussions need to come into play, and we need to really practically determine how we're going to engage our students at all levels, primary, secondary, tertiary, readers, okay? Because, literary education goes beyond the classroom space. How do we engage readers
I think Dr. Spencer may be having some tech issues on her end. Am I coming through okay? Okay, sounds like I might be. Do we have, say, just a few minutes for any kind of open discussion? I think we probably have to wrap up pretty soon. We haven't had much of a chance to talk to each other. Any final thoughts? I think this was a really exciting event, really good panel talks.
Thank you so much for having me here and letting me speak. It was wonderful to listen to all of you talk and just be a part of this.
Agreed. And what a great way to kind of take a book launch. I don't know if Ms. Joseph, you were thinking of it as a launch per se, but you know, to introduce an audience to a newly published book, but also have a really broad and important conversation. So I want to thank you, Ms. Joseph, for the book and for your willingness to participate in this conversation and for it to be able to go in all these different directions. Okay, so I think probably.
I was just saying thank you for having me. I mean, when I first wrote the book, I just wrote the book, and I mean, I heard all the technical aspects of writing and literature and so on. So hopefully if another one comes along, this will be more sound, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And I did learn quite a bit, I mean, from your other presenters also. Thank you very much.
I'd also like to thank anyone who tuned in and watched the YouTube stream. Thank you for joining. And I think we'll close here. On behalf of the Department of Literatures and English, thank you again for joining. And I wish you the very best. Bye for now.